rules. We would like this to be a conversation tonight. I'll keep going with a little introduction. Our panelists will speak, and then we would love to hear questions from you and from our community members on Zoom. For now, all Zoom audience members will be muted during our panelist presentations and then unmuted during the question and answer part of this program. To ask a question as a Zoom participant, please use the raise hand function. This can be found by clicking on the emoji-based reactions button at the bottom of your screen. Once you raise your hand, we will unmute you and you can ask your question to the room. One more reminder that we are recording tonight. Tonight's program is the third and final event in a series of community conversations exploring how we situate ourselves within time. The series explores new connections between past, present, and potential futures through the research of faculty and community scholars. In the exhibition, the Solastalgic Archive, artist Nina Elder defines solastalgia as the premonition of transition, a sense of loss from an anticipated future. She asks us to consider what it means to live in our current era of impact, urgency, and accelerated change. In the Deep Time Lab, we consider our place in the great expanse of geologic time, vis-a-vis living in an age that reveals that there is not a single predictable future, one knowable past, or one singular present moment. For tonight's program, our four panelists offer diverse research and praxis as answers to Nina Elder's call. They challenge the idea that a future world must be how our world works now by reshaping the potentiality of our human relationships with our planet, animals, plants, and more recently, artificial intelligence. Our panelists' work offers a collective story that is at once hopeful and cautionary, as well as rooted in our human past and the Earth's past of deep time. They show that history is not the only story that can be retold and revised. We invite you to join the conversation tonight after each of our panelists has the chance to present their work. So I'm thrilled to introduce our panelists tonight. Rem Moll is an associate professor in the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment. He came to UNH in 2020 after completing his PhD and postdoctoral training at Michigan State University. He conducts research and teaches in the areas of wildlife ecology and statistical modeling. Erin Sigel is a systemist specializing in the evolutionary history and genomics of plants, particularly ferns. She manages the UNH Herbarium, a natural history collection of preserved plants, and teaches plant biology courses. Momotaz Begum is a professor at the Computer Science Department, a roboticist. And Jennifer Brewer is faculty in the Department of Geography here at UNH. She's a political ecologist and focuses on social change. Let's introduce our panelists and we'll get started.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to the Zoomiverse out there. So as was just mentioned, my work is in the field of wildlife ecology and conservation. So we're going to talk about moose a little bit. But before we get there, I want to start. So I have like three periods that will come in this talk, and the first one's really all about we call shifting baselines. So shifting baselines, this is inspired by a quote I like to bring up from someone who was active in developing wildlife management in the 1900s. And Aldo Leopold said, "We grieve only for what we know." And the idea here is that, when we think about wildlife and conservation and species getting lost, if we grieve for losing things, that grief is shaped by what we consider to be normal and what we consider to be present in our everyday experience. And if we don't know about, for example, species being lost, then we have no reason to worry about it being lost or grieve its loss. So that coupled with some recent work suggesting that humans are losing our connection with nature. So a couple of books by Richard Louv talking about nature deficit disorder in our children, reconnecting with the natural world in a virtual age, thinking about how the world is urbanizing. Human beings spend more time indoors. I think Americans spend over 90% of their time indoors now. And then that along with some recent research suggesting that nature-based recreation is declining. There's an interesting blip in this trend due to COVID because everything was closed, so people didn't have anywhere to go. So everybody just went outside. But on a broader level, the overall trends in nature-based recreation are declining. So there's this disconnect between humans and nature. So I mentioned urbanization. This is an interesting figure. We live in an unprecedented time in human history in the sense that for the first time ever in our history, more humans live in cities than not. So the bars are the world's population's size and projected out to 2030. And the blue line is the portion of the human population that lives in cities. I'm sorry, that's the rural population. And the red line is the population that lives in cities. And you can see the two lines cross right around, depending on how you count, 2010, 2014. There was a change in the majority of people where they live, whether in cities or in rural areas. And that disparity is expected to increase over the next couple of decades. Connected to that is urban sprawl, which is sort of the city development moving out into the surrounding landscape, which is one of the #1 causes of species endangerment in the United States, because as you sprawl out from the city, you're changing habitat, but you're also creating things like roads, things like electricity connections, sewage lines, and all of that habitat change and destruction results in a lot of species loss. So those things kind of combined, the idea that we grieve only for what we know is shaped by our experience. Our experience is increasingly urban and indoors, are all playing a part in what we think of as conservation and what we ought to do about the world. So bringing this to some of my work, we work in the Cleveland Metro Parks, and my PhD student is here, Taylor, is working in the system. They call it the Emerald Necklace. I don't know if you guys have been to Cleveland. Cleveland's pretty sweet. You wouldn't expect it, maybe, in Cleveland. It's kind of a blue-collar city, but they have this amazing park system called the Emerald Necklace. It's a series of 18 parks that are connected around the city. And so we do a lot of work there. There's great wildlife populations, deer, foxes, and then high human recreation. So it's this interesting mix of human and wild coming together. So we have research sites all throughout these parks. And I'm not really going to talk so much about the ecology research, but I want to bring up something that is absolutely fascinating. This is a picture. One of the parks in this system is associated with the Cleveland Zoo. This is a picture from the Cleveland Zoo of an exhibit. It's kind of hard to see, of deer. And these are just white-tailed deer. These aren't like exotic deer, Sika deer from Asia. These are just the deer that we have here. There was an exhibit in Cleveland in the zoo in the 1890s because deer were so rare on the landscape at that time. It was like a treat to see a deer. Fast forward to 100 years later, there's a deer problem, too many deer. So a lot of Ohio and many parts of the eastern United States have reforested. We have extirpated deer's natural predator, wolves and mountain lions. And now there's too many of them, so there's this active management program that has to harvest and cull deer every year through sharpshooting, because hunting is not allowed in the city and there are no natural predators. So within 100 years, we had this like sea change from, oh my goodness, can you go see a deer in the zoo, to the deer are eating everything in the forest. We move them lethally. So the shifting baseline of a cute species, which brings up a lot of social issues about what do we do about this, because they can have a really negative impact on the ecosystem, but then people really value them, and so managing them is this really interesting mix of things, but it's all shaped by these baselines of what we think of as normal. Okay, so that's shifting baseline. So the second part of this talk, I'm going to touch on evolutionary time, so looking backwards and how it connects to contemporary issues in the present. And then I'll end on the future. I will get to the future since this is a future session, but gotta go backwards first. We're going to talk about moose. So that's a moose. They're wonderful creatures. Moose are big. They're bigger than deer. They're a lot bigger than deer, actually. And if you see them side by side, this is about the size comparison. So moose are an icon of New England, an icon of New Hampshire, again, high social value. This is a moose from one of our research sites near Berlin, north of the White Mountains. So the story of moose in New Hampshire looks like this, at least the story since 1900. There were not very many moose at the turn of the century in the state. And there was a slow, well, this is sort of, we're taking our best guess, we don't really know, but there was a slow increase over the next 80 years, and then a population explosion in the 80s. And then since about 2000, it's been on a steady decline. And that's true not only for New Hampshire, but also for other New England states. And the reason for this is because, well, there's a couple of reasons, and they compound upon one another. So in the 1800s, following colonization, there was widespread land development for farm and agriculture. And that's where the stone walls come that we see in New Hampshire. That's where they come from. And then the colonists are like, hey, the Midwest, there's a lot better soil in the Midwest. Let's go farm there. Abandon all of these farms. They grew back into pine forest. That was harvested. And then what we see today is the forest that followed that, second growth forest. And the reason why that matters for moose is because moose need young forest. So clearing land and letting it grow back is really good for moose. Logging is really beneficial for moose in terms of providing food. Then in the 70s, there was an outbreak of the spruce budworm, this insect shown there in the top left. And there were widespread, it infested huge swaths of especially fir trees in northern New Hampshire. And when that was happening, that timber is very marketable, and so it was all harvested. It's called salvage harvest, so it could be sold because it's going to die anyway. And so you have a picture like this where you have these huge areas of clear-cut forest that's all going to grow back, and as soon as it hits about 4 or 5 years old, it's like moose buffet. It's like the best moose habitat you can get. So great for moose, and that really drove this really steep incline. Then the ticks came. Well, they were always here. So what's happening now, and one of the main reasons for the decline of moose is the winter tick, which is shown here. They exist like in these mats on moose. They can have up to 50,000 ticks. It's 25 pounds of ticks. That's a lot of blood loss, and basically what happens is the moose become anemic and weak, and then there's like a cold snap in the spring, and they die of exposure. So that's the main problem at the moment. So the question is, getting back to deer, why is this so devastating for moose and not deer? Because winter ticks are also on deer, and that's actually how the parasite got transferred to the moose in the first place. But they don't really affect the deer population. Why is that? Well, one of the hypotheses is that they have different grooming strategies. So deer are what we might call a program groomer. They groom instinctually. They're like your cat, which grooms themselves. Whereas moose are more of a stimulus groomer, where they wait until there's an irritation to start grooming. And one of the issues is when they do that, by then it's starting to be too late and the ticks accumulate. And how this relates to deep time is white-tailed deer, their evolutionary history have been in North America for about 10 million years. Moose came over the ice bridge maybe 15,000 years ago, and have not co-evolved with this tick in the same way deer have. And so their evolutionary history has positioned them very poorly to deal with this parasite, whereas the deer, that's not the case. And then this is exacerbated by a warming climate, because if we have, like right now, how warm it is outside, the longer it takes to get a good snowfall, the better it is for ticks. Is the short version of it. So shorter winters mean more ticks, and that's obviously having an impact on this. So what we see today on the landscape has this deep time relationship in evolutionary history, complex relationships. So when we think about the future of these charismatic megafauna, these large species that are highly valued by society, like moose and deer, what will happen? Will ticks cause moose extinction? Just leave that out there and we can come back to it later. So my students can answer that maybe, hopefully. We'll talk about it in class. What other species, what other charismatic megafauna are in trouble besides these ones we've talked about? Well, deer aren't really in trouble, but most of them are large carnivores. They're large carnivores at the top of the food chain. They exist in low densities naturally. So species like these you see here. It's from a recent paper where they sort of cataloged the world's large carnivores and how many are out there. And you can see that bears are doing real good. Black bears in particular are good at taking advantage of human modified landscapes. Brown bears doing pretty well. And then, but the vast majority of these large carnivore species exist at pretty low numbers. We think there's about 30,000 African lions left in the world. Something like 5,000 to 10,000 cheetah. These are not large numbers. And that's important not only from a societal perspective, because we value these species, but also because a lot of times these top predators have cascading and complicated effects throughout food webs. And so losing them is not just a loss of a species, it's a loss of an ecosystem function. So what are some solutions? You know, what kind of conversations should hopefully this, events like this lead to? Well, there's a couple of ideas out there. One of them is called 30 by 30. And the idea is that we should just preserve 30% of the earth by the year 2030. Just set aside 30% of the earth. And there's a lot of dialogue about this, whether it's a good or bad idea. There's a lot of big universities and NGOs behind the idea. There's a lot of criticism of it as well, because who gets to decide what's preserved and how does that impact the people who might live in that area? So it's a huge social justice, environmental issue. But that's one potential solution, is these large megafauna need space. So we need to consider that. Or we can just coexist with them. So this is in North Carolina. Black bears are very flexible and take advantage of anthropogenic food sources. So there's a coexistence aspect here. But again, you have to take into account the human component, because we sitting in this room in the United States might feel like, well, yeah, we should just coexist with them. But if you're an African pastoralist that depends on livestock that you graze on the African savanna, and lions are killing your livestock, then coexistence means a very different thing. So that's an important consideration. Certainly, climate change is a huge issue. Should we fight climate warming? We think about the ticks and winter ticks and moose. Yeah, certainly that is a massive thing that's going to shape a lot of these species persistence, but it's going to shape them all in different ways, and there are going to be different winners and losers. Some of them will actually benefit, and many others will lose. Do we need to recalibrate those baselines that I was mentioning? This was an opinion piece that I was a part of that was recently published that talked about intergenerational equity. I have 3 children. I would love to think that they are going to be in a world where these sites shown here still exist, but they might not. And so us as a generation now living, the decisions we make are affecting them and potentially taking away that opportunity to enjoy these. So, thinking about D time and looking forward to the talks here. The solutions are going to be dynamic because ecological problems like this don't go away, they just change. Their intensity changes, the nature, they're dynamic, they shift over time. They're affected by evolutionary processes, they're affected by human perception of baselines, and the future is highly, highly uncertain, I would argue. I mean, if you think about climate change, anybody doing ecological research in the 50s, before climate change was really on the radar, is all of that work irrelevant because they didn't see climate change coming? Well, not necessarily, but the situation that we're in now, 100 years ago, was almost unfathomable. So what that probably means is that whatever is going to happen 100 years from now is something we will not anticipate, right? So this is why interdisciplinary thinking and cooperation will be surely key to any solutions that would have any chance of working. So that's what I have. Thanks for your attention, and I'll pass it off.
Yeah.
Is that what I should do?
Yeah,
Okay,
thanks.
great, thanks.
Before Erin starts, we're still having a little bit of a tech issue, and again, I'm so sorry for that. But I'm just gonna make sure everyone's. Rem, I will say, when you sent me your PowerPoint, that tick photo on the deer ruined my day.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Everybody,
It completely ruined my day.
you have to see it.
Like I couldn't get it out of my head. I was driving home when I just saw the deer. And
There are worse pictures
thank you for
from
the
that.
spirit.
Yeah.
That one got the point
When
from.
the animals die.
They got the point.
Very sad.
All right. Hi, I am very excited to be part of this panel and very excited to hear the other talks too. However, when I was invited to participate in a panel about the future, I had a lot of trepidation. And that's because I've spent most of my career researching and teaching about the evolutionary past. And I also spend a lot of my time managing historical natural history collections. As Molly alluded to in her introduction, my job at UNH has a couple of different interconnected components. See if I can run this beast. Here we go. All right, so first, by training, I'm a plant systematist, and that's a type of evolutionary biologist who uses patterns found in plant morphology, as well as in their DNA sequences, to reconstruct how plant species are related to one another and how they've evolved from common ancestors. So being a plant systematist is kind of analogous to being a genealogist, only we reconstruct relationships over the past 450 million years. That's basically since plants have colonized land. Ooh. Can't see my own slides anymore. I'm sorry.
No, I don't think you did. Sorry, this room is just not cooperating with us today. Well, in the audience, thank you again for hanging in.
Press the magic button.
The one that said, do not press this button.
Eject. In this building, we are one of the older buildings on campus, so sometimes things just.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Right, so I was saying that being a plant systematist is kind of like being a genealogist for plants, but we work in really deep time. If you've ever seen one of these black and white type branching diagrams over here, This was a type of diagram probably drawn by a systematist. And the tips of the branches that are all the way to your right represent species that are alive or extant today. And as you work your way to the left, deeper into the tree diagram, the branching points represent the ancestors of those species. This phylogeny happens to be about ferns, which is one of my favorite research groups. However, the tree diagrams themselves are just a starting point. Systematists give life to the evolutionary history of groups of plants by using these trees to model things like how and why plant lineages have diverged from each other, how to reconstruct their historical geographic distributions and morphologies, and also to estimate historic rates of speciation and extinction. The second part of my job at UNH is that I manage UNH's herbarium, which is a natural history collection of preserved plants. The herbarium was founded in 1892 and holds over 206,000 plant and algae specimens that were collected by UNH scientists, collaborators, and students. The UNH herbarium holds the best record of the flora of New Hampshire, but it also has specimens from all 50 states, US territories, and 89 countries. So it really is a record of plant diversity over space and time. Here are some of the images of our herbarium specimens. And when plants are collected, they're pressed, dried, and fixed to archival quality paper. They can live like this, they're not allowed. They can stay like this for hundreds of years. And these specimens are really invaluable sources of morphological, genetic, and ecological data. And they really allow systematists and other scientists to travel back in evolutionary space and time. So I deal with the past a lot. And what can a plant systematist like myself and natural history collections like the herbarium tell us about the future of plant biodiversity, especially a future in the Anthropocene, which is a time marked by unprecedented impact on biodiversity, leading to unprecedented rates of extinction. So I thought about explaining how systematists use those tree diagrams to predict which plant groups are more prone to extinction and which are more likely to flourish in the future of the Anthropocene. But I don't really have it in me right now to give a technical lecture this late at night. And besides, I think the dramatic headlines really speak for themselves. And there's very little doubt about extinction in the future. The change in plant diversity is going to be very dramatic. There's a near scientific consensus that there will be mass extinction of plant species at a rate of 100 times or greater our background extinction rate before human actions. The composition of our plant biodiversity is going to shift immensely. So instead of giving a lecture, I thought that I would tell you a story. And it's a story about extinction, but it's also a story that's really close to home. And it's a story that I think will become more and more common in the future. And if you humor me, I think it offers some really good insights into what it feels like, or I say feels like as a scientist, to be a scientist that discovers a plant extinction. And that story is about crabgrass, not exactly charismatic megafauna. And I know people who hate or who like tidy yards really hate crabgrass. But to a plant systematist, crabgrass is a really interesting diverse genus of about 220 species that are mostly found in the tropics and warm temperate regions. In the United States, there are 18 native species of crabgrass, 3 of which are endemic or found only in the United States. So about a year and a half ago, I got an email from the New Hampshire state botanist, Bill Nichols, about a crabgrass species, Digitaria labilumis, or slender crabgrass. And this perked my interest because slender crabgrass is a super special species of crabgrass. It's one of only 4 species known only from New Hampshire. And furthermore, it's what we call a single site index. It was only ever collected from Rock Rimmon in Manchester. Has anyone ever been to Rock Rimmon? It's this big rock. It's got a park right next to it. Well, Bill had been contacted by a grass systematist who had found a couple of plants that were remarkably similar to our slender crabgrass from New Hampshire at 2 locations in Mexico. And as you know, Mexico is a long way from New Hampshire. So this would be a very unusual geographic distribution for a species. And Bill wanted to know if we could use genetic data to see if the plants in Mexico and New Hampshire are the same species. So to do this, and to answer this question, we assembled a team of scientists. Some included grass systematists and grass morphological experts. But we ran into a really big problem right away. See, despite several years of searching, Bill had been unable to find another specimen of slender crabgrass at Rock Rimmon, and he feared that it had been extirpated from the site. And furthermore, when we looked back at rare plant surveys of Rock Rimmon over the past 100 years, it was last documented from the site in 1938. So that meant that we had to end up asking and trying to answer another really unfortunate question, which is slender crabgrass an extinct species? In the end, we ended up sampling DNA from the only known specimens of slender crabgrass, which are 3 specimens from the University of New Hampshire herbarium and a few others from the University of West Virginia. And to make a long story short, we were able to sequence chloroplast genomes from the herbarium specimens and a couple of other really closely related species of crabgrass. And what we found was that the plants from Mexico are very closely related. The plants from Mexico are in blue, and they're very closely related to slender crabgrass from New Hampshire, but they're not the same species. In fact, our slender crabgrass, which is in red here, is most closely related to Caribbean crabgrass in yellow, which is a species that's only found in the most southern tip of Florida, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. So, and together then, Caribbean crabgrass and slender crabgrass, their next closest relative are the plants from Mexico. So what did we learn? It appears that plants in Mexico are not slender crabgrass, but some other previously undetected species. And unfortunately, it seems that slender crabgrass is indeed an extinct species. Prior to this work, there were 64 documented plant extinctions in the United States and Canada. And slender crabgrass is number 65. And it's the first known plant extinction for the state of New Hampshire. So this is an unfortunate loss for the plant biodiversity of New Hampshire. And it's a new data point for this dramatic loss of plant species that's only going to become more and more common the further we move into the Anthropocene. But I learned something else, and that was kind of my perspective as a scientist. And it made me realize that extinctions are silent. They sound and feel silent. There wasn't a big dramatic announcement, and the earth didn't shake when that last individual slender crabgrass disappeared from Rock Rimmon in Manchester. Instead, it just slipped away sometime in the last 80 years with the only record of its existence stored somewhere in an herbarium cabinet. And I think that this is going to be more and more common in the future as we move forward. And all of these silent extinction events contributing to a big dramatic trend of extinction. But it's not all gloom. We discovered a new species in Mexico, and I think that this is a really good reminder that species will always continue to evolve and diversify, even in the Anthropocene, and there will always be more biodiversity to discover. And it also made me understand, maybe truly, really understand for the first time, that systematics isn't just about the past. And it made me see how vital herbaria and other natural history collections will be for documenting and understanding biodiversity as we move further into the Anthropocene future. Sorry about the technical difficulty.
It's not you. We're gonna hear from Momotaz. Thank you.
So thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. I'm Momotaz. I'm a faculty member in the assistant professor in the computer science department. I am a roboticist by profession, meaning that I make robots artificially intelligent so that they can work seamlessly with human. And I apologize, the stuff that I'll be talking about are so much dry than compared to what they have been talking about. So, you know, I apologize in advance. So, yeah, and also the stuff that I'll be talking about is very much futuristic. So the topic is robot-mediated aging in place. You'll certainly not see robot helping your grandma or even mother age in place. But when you and I, most of you, or many of you and I age, my hope is that when we need, these machines will be there to support us. So let me go into the detail of this. So the first question is that why do we need machine to age in place? The answer is demographic shift. There may be some deep time discussion that we could do, but I'm not good in philosophy, I'm not good in history, I'm only good in robotics. So I'm going to stick to that. So I'll just give you some numbers, which will probably put things into perspective. All elderly populations are increasing as compared to that. Birth rate is declining. So there are more people who need care as compared to the more people who can provide care. The cost of nursing home, the cost of health are increasing exponential rate, and we are talking about a population who doesn't have a stable income. Combining all of this, we are thinking about alternative solutions. And robotics, artificial intelligence, technology is a potential alternative solution. You like it or not. I know that nobody likes to age in with a machine, but I have spoken with many elderly folks living in care homes, living independently, and yes, they say that if we get someone who would remind me when it is time to take my medication, who would help me to do some daily activities. Yes, I don't like robot, but I would take it in. So that's the reality of life. And again, I don't want to go to the philosophical discussion, right versus wrong. I'm just doing what it feels right to me. Okay. So the question is that what are the ways robot can help you? Okay. So here are some examples. Some of them are from my lab. Some of them are from people from other labs. On the left, that was the work I did a long time ago when we started doing research in this direction. The whole idea was that the person that we're seeing here with dementia, we volunteer to come to our study, and many people with dementia, they have difficulty remembering the sequence. One common task is team making, bursts of sequence, recruit bursts of structure. They have difficulty to remember those. So we have a helper robot which provides step-by-step guidance. The robot literally follows the person wherever he goes or she goes and help our activities of daily living. In the middle, you are seeing one of the students teaching, one of my PhD students teaching a robot. This is in Kingsbury, Southside, my lab. It's teaching a robot how to scoop some food from a bowl and eat. The idea is that the robot will learn that this is how I scoop, this is how I feed a person, and the way we are envisioning is that after the learning, if the person change, if the person's position change, if the bowl position change, if the spoon position change, the robot will be adapt to those changing scenarios, because that's what we want in the home environment. On the very right, what you are seeing is that a robot is learning how to do different kind of motor exercises, especially when people have, say for instance, suffer stroke, has limited motor movement, they have to do different kind of therapeutic exercises. Those of you who are familiar with this know that we have therapist shortage, and most of the insurance doesn't allow more than 2 therapist visits per week. Those visits are expensive. So the idea that we're talking about is that if we have robots which can learn those exercises from the therapist, and those robots sit in outpatient, and instead of you seeing the therapist, you work with the robot, because the robot literally carries the same knowledge with respect to motion as the therapist. So that way, you don't have to see the therapist, but the robot collects your data. It gives you feedback that this is the motions that you are doing wrong. This joint needs to be rotated further in this direction, and so on and so forth. And the therapist can periodically fetch those data from the robot. Okay. So that's the idea that we are talking about. All of those are funded through National Science Foundation. All of them are funded through National Science Foundation. And the bottom that you are seeing some other use cases where the robot can help with health monitoring, can provide cognitive support, and of course, companionship. The robot can tell story, play music that the person likes, connect the person with the loved ones periodically or based on demand. So these are different examples where robots can help an elderly to age gracefully at home or age peacefully at home. Now, among different activities that we do, today I will be mostly talking about a project that we just started. It's just literally this fall. So we got an NIH-R01 grant. It's a $3 million grant. Idea is that we want to design care robots specifically to help people with dementia age in place. It's not about community setting. They want to stay in their home. We want to see how long we can keep them home while keeping them safe, maintaining home safety, maintaining their activity and engagement, keeping them connected with the people they need to be connected to, and managing their health. And at the same time, while we do all of those, we want to make sure that the caregiver burden is reduced. Okay, so that's the whole purpose of this project. And this is a project with Professor Sajjad from occupational therapy and Professor Dane Rauscher from exercise science. And as a matter of fact, some of the projects that I showed you before, we three actually collaborated in all three of them. I take care of the tech side, they take care of the clinical side. So we make a really good team. So as I said, that we just started this project, and this is a this is schematic diagram of what we envision, that the home will be loaded with different kind of IoT sensors or Internet of Things sensor. All of the sensors will be talking to the robot. So the robot will be kind of the adult in the room, and will be making sure that the home is safe, the person is engaged, all the health related activities are going on. When required, the robot will take charge to connect the person or older adults with dementia with the caregiver or with the physician or emergency facility if required. So that's the whole idea. So we have a nice promotional video that we did And Sajal will be, basically explaining that what we want to do. We designed actually a prototype robot, which gives an example of the type of activities that we will be doing. So that was pre-pandemic 2019. And after that, we submitted an NIH grant, a couple of iterations. We got the grant in 2021. So I will let you. So I'll stop there. So this was the prototype, as I said, that was back in 2019, pre-pandemic. Life was beautiful. So we did those study, and this is our goal over the next 5 years to include as many care modality as possible. And test them in people home. We proposed a randomized control trial to do, and to the best of my knowledge, this is the first RCT of this nature where we are deploying artificially intelligent machine to people home and stay with them for an extended period of time. So we actually tested the prototype with 8 caregivers of people with dementia, and they came, worked with the robot, provided us their suggestions, and everyone kind of unanimously agreed that when they will be at that age, maybe 80 or 90, they expect that the technology to be ready. So somehow it is related to future some topic of this panel. Now, since I am here and I'm good at technology, I would like to throw in some of the behind the scene. I promise that I will not be too technical. So behind the scene, what happens is that we have a lot of interconnected complex algorithm which talks to each other to make sure that the robot understands what is happening, the robot knows what to do, what not to do. One of the things that I feel like that many of you will be able to connect, and I want to talk a little bit more, is the transparency. And many of you may have heard the term of algorithmic transparency or explainability of algorithm or explainability of AI and machine. And that is applicable here as well. Because what we are doing here is that we are designing algorithms, we're designing artificial intelligence systems which will make decisions for the older adults, for human beings. So it's likely that we have to ask this question that will they ask the robot that why did you do this or why did you not do this? So it's very likely they will ask the question. And then the question is that can algorithm or can the machine explain to them why it did what it did? Sometimes, some algorithms have that capability. But when the algorithm explains, will the person be able to understand algorithmic explanation? Answer is no, period. Why? Because, the algorithm that we work on, they're extremely complex. You need PhD level training to understand those algorithms, to design those algorithms. So what we generally do is something that we call post hoc transparency. Simply put, that we distill some of the information from those complex algorithms and distill it to a simpler model. Okay? Now, the question is that we think that those are simpler, and who are we to, say that, oh, these are simpler, and they will be able to understand that. Okay? So to this date, that is the notion that we design those algorithms, and then we say that, oh, those are so complex. Let's make them simple. We design another set of algorithms, and we say that, oh, these are simple. So we are trying to ask the difficult question is that say that those algorithms are understandable by everyone. So only way to know that is that we run user studies. We designer, we sit with those population, ask them that, do you understand what the robot just explained to you? Does it make sense to you? Okay, so this is something that we are trying to do. So we designed a complex architecture deployed in the robot, but we kind of adopted a part of algorithm or type of algorithm, which we call AI plan or artificial intelligence plan, which looks something like that. Okay, again, this is as an algorithmic researcher, this is my understanding that this is probably more understandable than any other algorithm that we design, because it has some semantics which is related to natural language. But again, at the end of the day, our end user will decide that is it something that they understand or not. So to this date, our data shows that this kind of plans are human understandable, but the caveat is that the process of making them is super, super complicated. So even if they are understandable, but if they want to change those plans, which they will definitely do, how will we do it? Because as I mentioned, that this is a super complicated process. So that is something that we are working on currently in my lab, side by side of delivering the promise that we gave to NIH, that we're going to design this kind of robot, and we'll see that how they can help people age in place. So altogether, I'll just conclude by saying that designing machine or designing robots, which can help older adults, which can help me age in place when I grow old. It's a long, complex journey, and I believe that we are just starting the process. And I really do hope that when my time comes, when I need the support from this kind of machine, the technology will be first. So I'll just stop there. Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much to the Art Museum for convening this diverse panel. I think it's really helping us to sort of like stretch our brains and the directions and have some sort of lateral connections, which I think is helpful, because thinking about the future is really hard, as I think we all found who's trying to put these together. So I want to go back to the original definition of the word solastalgia that a guy named Glenn Albrecht invented a couple decades ago. And he was really merging two root words that mean both comfort and grief. So he defined solastalgia as the pain we experience when we recognize that our home environment is irreversibly transformed, such as by ecological devastation, and we are unable to find comfort there as we otherwise. So obviously, as hearing, we live in a time when our own species is radically changing our planet. Our unsustainable use of Earth's resources causes problems such as global heating, biodiversity loss, persistent toxicity in our food, air, water, and creating these deep, deep uncertainties about our future. And related, uncertainties are being intensified by accelerating changes to human livelihoods, migration patterns, increasing probability of pandemics, political economic instabilities driven by consolidation of wealth by the privileged few, and so on. So various writers, including psychologists, find that these uncertainties are generating broad feelings of solastalgia around much of the world. So reflecting this, solastalgia is now the topic of actually several artworks and musical and film productions, including the present exhibit by Mina Elder. So I'm trying to get my head around what this means and how to connect sort of our personal experiences to the broader reality. Thinking about people that I know, I perceive roughly 3 general reactions to this awareness that our Earth is changing irreversibly. Some people seem to be more or less aware, but find it so uncomfortable that they mostly avoid thinking about it. Some think about it quite often as a sort of background noise to our daily lives, but it causes a somewhat distracting level of anxiety and depression for some of us, right? Of course, there's this third possibility, which is to recognize the inevitability of uncertainties, as other speakers have mentioned, and therefore focus on what we can do to sustain viable livelihoods into the future. I mean, this is, in fact, is the necessity. So we might remind ourselves that actually throughout human existence, humans have always lived with uncertainties, such as possibilities of starvation from crop failures, enslavement by invaders, dying from disease or childbirth, is quite common in the past. So uncertainty is a fundamentally human experience. Certainly the present is unprecedented in the global scale and irreversibility, profound transformations. But perhaps it is also different in that more of us have greater expectations for certainty and stability. Expectations, I would argue, that have been encouraged by the wealthiest beneficiaries of unfettered capitalism and current social order. Also, in past political conflicts, even if an armed force killed most people in a village, burned it to the ground, at least the survivors could eventually see similar ecological, social ecological relationships persisting elsewhere, such as they could migrate to a neighboring community, there to help sort of overcome their grief. They probably see some of the same birds singing, some of the same plants growing. Neighboring folks would probably share somewhat recognizable foods, architecture, music, rituals, or language. This could really provide a sense of belonging and perpetuity, right? A sense of history and humanity that's larger than ourselves, which is something I think humans fundamentally crave. A sense of meaning and comfort generated, in fact, by collectivity. Now that most communities, near and far, are experiencing rapid social ecological change, amplified by our global connections, it becomes harder to find such places of refuge. Solastalgia is not necessarily a new feeling then, but much of the world's population is now experiencing it simultaneously. Ironically, I suspect solastalgia also feels more overwhelming because of our isolation from collectivities. Even as we are more digitally connected, most of our personal social bonds have weakened in recent decades. Those folks who have strategically divided us, rich from poor, right from left, white from black from brown, old from young, differently abled, have in fact eroded our sense of mutual aid and cooperation. Alienated this way from one another and from the very concept of civil society, we are more easily manipulated by swindlers, by demagogues, to fear the worst instead of building a better future. So when Mina Elder presents this traveling exhibit and encourages participants to contribute their own artifacts and artworks to this collection, she's really fostering a sense of collective agency. Right? She's inviting us to express our creative selves through material and conceptual interactions, and to place that expression within the context of others doing the same. So those who contribute artifacts reinvent our physical surroundings within the exhibit space. We generate a new materiality that did not exist previously and will be dismantled and reaggregated as exhibition moves on. So Elder calls it a deep time lab, right? A place of experimentation, process, and development that encourages a long-term view, partly to help, I think, to help process the anxieties of the day. So this reminds me of a major longitudinal study run by social scientists at Yale. they increasingly find that the overwhelming majority of people in the United States know climate change is happening, know humans are causing it, and want government and business to address the driving causes, actually with relative common ground on what they think appropriate actions would be, at least when asked. Sadly, the vast majority of our public, according to the study, also believe that the vast majority of other people in the United States disagree with their position. Right? So in other words, when it comes to understanding the science of climate change and what to do about it, most people in this country have vastly more in common than we realize. Recognition that we're in the majority, not the minority, could change our political landscape and policy outcomes. It can shift the prevailing questions from why are other people making bad decisions to how can we harness our energies in a collective way to make them better, right? So I'm also reminded of a book by a woman, Rebecca Solnit, called Paradise Built in Hell. And in this book, she summarized decades of social science research on human behavior in the aftermath of disaster. There are countless cases showing that when disasters overwhelm the formal institutions of government, people form new, ad hoc, cooperative relationships to solve the most pressing problems. They engage in mutual aid, and they even risk personal sacrifice to help others. We see this repeatedly over and over around the world. So, for example, Solnit tells us how on September 11th, when the elevators in Manhattan's Twin Towers stopped, office workers spontaneously self-organized, help each other down the stairs. Afterward, as in other disasters around the world, communities spontaneously self-organize to provide necessary public services, including search and rescue, medical assistance, food, water, shelter, and emotional support. These behaviors start to seem more like the cooperation we see among ants and bees. I'm no wildlife ecologist, but sort of what we intuitively know, than the stereotypical Hollywood heroes who act alone with superhuman strength, while the rest of us stand by and wait to be rescued. On the other hand, after most disasters, pre-existing government entities eventually do step in, for better or for worse. Often, elites try to squelch widespread public self-organization because they kind of find it confusing, messy, or even threatening to the familiar social order. Faced by this emergent phenomena, they try to restore the former status quo, but may or may not succeed. So, for example, tens of thousands of deaths caused by collapsed buildings in Mexico City's 1985 earthquake triggered decades of social movements that ended 70 years of authoritarian single-party rule and advanced democracy and social justice. The human brain always tries to oversimplify things, including disaster stories, including climate change. The notion is, a couple other talks kind of started to mention, the notion of linear progress that is so familiar in this country is really a modernist construct, right? It's produced, I would argue, partly by industrial capitalism. Reality is so much messier. It's less linear, it's less certain, and it's much more characterized by the alternative and diverse possibilities of complexity. So what if we take our current apparently disastrous moment to envision a new social material contract between government and people, right? What if fossil fuels no longer dominate geopolitics? What if we develop energy resources less amenable to authoritarian control? What if we center a new social order, not on the competition of relatively unfettered markets, but on mutual aid and cooperation? So, in all honesty, I would not have asked these questions in public a few years ago, but I often hear them from our students. It continues to astonish me how frequently students raise their hand and ask these questions right out loud, right? And in this sense of sort of honest wonder, like, why is it? And I would argue that Elder is asking us to begin this collective conversation, right? Starting solastalgia, but then progressing into a more decentralized pattern toward whatever emergent futures we might choose. And I would guess this is why, I don't want to play our historian here, I'm not, but maybe this is why Convict, our curators, selected for this exhibit poster resembles both a snow globe and a crystal ball. So the color inside is black instead of white, and the two arms of an oil well are balancing on it, right? We can hope that this is in fact not a vision of the future, but will soon be understood as a relic.
That side of things. Thanks you all.
Thanks you all for coming today and just for bearing with our technical difficulties as we try to work through them. But I just want to say, as the organizer of this panel, all of you have hit this point, Jeff. I think you said it a few times in your piece at the end, just this uncertainty and how humans start to wrap their minds around it. And that's the big question that we've been looking at. That's my job as the museum educator here at UNH. It's how do we take these huge concepts like solastalgia, climate change, loss of species, the idea of a changing future in terms of robotics or not human, not animal, something new, and begin to pull them apart and talk about them in ways that aren't divisive, aren't cataclysmic, but are, if you're saying, Jennifer, it's almost like a mutual aid conversation and collaboration. And to me, the interdisciplinary nature of it and the points that each one of our panelists brought and their expertise in each one of these areas speaks to that uncertainty. And what I had in a conversation with each one of them when I was telling them about this panel and this series and asking them to be on it, it was my conversation with Momotaz, who said, you know, the reason she's working in robotics, and you said it in your talk too, is not because necessarily you want AI or robots or a machine to take care of you as you age, but it's the reality. And it's how are we digging into that reality and that uncertainty that we addressed tonight, and that I just can't tell you how much I loved each one of your talks. Thank you. I know I asked you to speak, but it was all so fascinating. So what I want to do now is just turn it over to the audience for questions and back in. No, that's okay. I was just telling folks, you know, what I appreciated about each one of your talks was how you talked about this uncertainty without it being cataclysmic or just digging into it in different ways in this interdisciplinary conversation. So, yeah, does anyone have a question from the audience? We'll go there first. Yeah.
I think my questions might be for Erin and Rem. Sorry, I'm a biologist, and I can't get over the fact that there are only 65 plants, and that's in North America.
Well, it's in the United States and Canada.
Okay.
right?
And then I think Rem then answered it. Well, yeah, there's probably a ton of them, but we didn't know they were there. So I wonder, is there any kind of relationship that somebody knows that says, based on how much we don't know, how many are there really? Did I ask my question right? If we know there's 65, how many are there really?
Well, in regards to plants specifically, I think there's been interesting history to this. So, in the past, I want to say 400 years in the world, there's been 600 documented cases of plant extinction. That's all that's been documented. However, there have been some projects to try to refine some of these species, and we are back up to just 400. So we have refound some of these species. It's actually a bit hopeful. Yeah, but you're right. Like the vast majority of these extinctions are kind of slipping away, and we may have them documented in natural history collections, and we may not. I think there's a very large range of the estimated number of plant extinctions per million years. That's generally how it's measured. And I think on average, it's estimated to be, our rate of extinction is 18 million, or is 18 plants per million year, whereas historically it's 0.4. So I don't have a number for you, but there's a lot more out there.
And is the number of animals in North America, is there a relationship between plants and animals extinctions? Okay. I think it was 4 to 1 when I used to teach it, and I was just wondering, it's been 10 years since I taught that class. So for every plant, I thought there were like 4 animals or something.
That have gone extinct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, we don't know what animals are out there. We only know the big cool ones.
There's also a lot more plants than there are animals too.
Yeah. I think your point is a great one, which is like kind of related to the idea of what I would call like imperfect detection. And I think as humans, we're not always, our brains aren't always great at like taking that into consideration. And we saw it with COVID, when COVID first started, if you look at like the cases of COVID when they built up, you know, it looks like there weren't very many cases at first and then it spiked, but it was just a testing, right? It was just a testing issue. It was actually spiking, you know, prior to that. And so thinking about like what's out there and our technologies and abilities to find where these things are and monitor them has to incorporate this imperfect detection. For species like, you know, moose, it's easier. But yeah, there's a lot of species where that uncertainty, I think, is pretty high.
We lose a lot of biodiversity before we even know we had it.
Yeah, the silent extinction you mentioned, I think is a really striking concept. It just went away and found out later.
And I think that's why it hit particularly hard. That extinction is silent. Like I never thought of it that way. And oh gosh, that's good. And it really hits in a way that people can digest it too, even if you're not studying these huge systems or understanding all of the modeling. You can understand that very far down explanation.
I had a question about the AI robots, and what do you predict or project the time frame to be that somebody could live independently? What's the severity of the Alzheimer's that they would have, and how long would somebody with robotic assistance be allowed to live independently? And I know that everybody's Alzheimer's might progress at a different rate, but at some point, the person would just not even know what the command is. So is it like what are you projecting as you think about this kind of research for this supportive technology? Is it a 1-year window, 10 months, or?
Really great questions. Probably my clinical collaborators are the best person to give you precise answer, but I can give you what we have been discussing about it is that we'll see how much we can do. As you say, that there are stage of the disease, and at some point we know that no amount of care support through the machine will be sufficient. So we are just trying to see that how much we can push. If it's 6 more months, it is 6 more months. If it's 1 more year, then if it's one more year. Another thing that, as I said, that we are collecting different markers. If we can, something that nobody has ever investigated, that if there is a 24/7 assistant there who makes sure that the health is okay, the activity engagement is okay, because those the modality that I was talking about, there are research studies which shows that being active help people with Alzheimer's. Being connected with the loved ones help them with respect to cognitive health, with respect to physical health. Maybe having a 24/7 assistant, it will help them in way to, I don't know if using the word, delay the progression of the disease is the right thing, because I'm not a clinician, so I don't know anything about those, but I see the discussion, I hear the discussion among my clinical colleagues that this is something to investigate, that does it help? But in any case, we know that there will be a time where the machine won't be helpful anymore. So we want to see how much we can push. And it may be just, case by case basis.
Exciting.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
I know that all of you are respective experts in your fields.
I was wondering, what do you think the hardest way to convey all of this information, such as problems and solutions, is for each of you, I guess? Like, probably a lot to think about, but that's probably like really broad. But for example, like with the winter tick, for example, how do you convey that as a problem, and like how do you convey that to the public and say that it's a problem and like basically get knowledge out?
Communications and you're asking what's the hardest part about communicating this kind of finding?
How do you make it relevant for people outside of like
Yes.
spaces like this and how they can connect with it? Good question.
I guess you send them a picture of ticks.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Like, I mean, that emotional response is something that I think should be used carefully and strategically as scientists and academics, but it's really important to like make a connection with people's feelings and emotions and what they care about. And you know, so a lot of the winter tick work was done by a professor that recently retired from UNH, Dr. Pete Beacons in our department. And he talks about how he like saw a young moose that was just covered in ticks, dying a slow, horrible death. And it was so impactful to him that it really, I don't know, inspired, but it really drove a lot of his curiosity and like his motivation to do the work and convince people that this is actually what's causing this problem. So I think that emotional piece is important.
I would say that it's pretty context dependent. The type of problem that you are trying to convey. That's number one factor. Number two factor is who is your audience. Yeah, so if I am sitting in front of a bunch of engineering and computer science students, I don't have to explain how difficult the AI is. But of course, if I'm with a non-CS, non-engineering students, then I have to find out a way to convey to you that why designing this is difficult. So it can't, first of all, it's context dependent, the type of problem and the audience that you are trying to connect.
I mean, I think you would try to make it as relevant to your audience's life as possible. So like, you know, if I were speaking to maybe a more, you know, a non-university crowd, I might talk less about crabgrass and more about plants that are important in, you know, being for drug development or for medical products. I think, yeah, showing some emotionality or emotional connection to what you're talking about goes a long way too. Just mirroring that these things are important to you, I think can be a first step in suggesting it should be important to them as well.
Yeah,
Yeah, maybe that's a little unsatisfactory, but these are really, that's really is like a hardest part of the job sometimes.
no, I would agree that that's sort of recognizing the emotions. I mean, I deal with this in teaching as well, right? Because there's some things that we talk about that are really kind of scary and nerve-wracking, right? And can become really overwhelming. And there's some other things that are just really pie in the sky and cool and awesome and knows, you know, we're gonna reestablish ourselves in outer space or whatever. And so helping people sort of recognize the anxieties and fears and uncertainties, and it's okay, you're gonna have some emotions. I know again in like the biophysical sciences, like don't talk about emotions, right? But we're all having emotions. But that's not the end of the story, that's the beginning, right? So then what can we do? How can we sort of strike that balance, sort of practical and realistic as possible? Just not getting paralyzed. It's so easy to get paralyzed. Because then you just check out, right? I'm not gonna think about this anymore.
I had a question for you, since your class is thinking about these topics, like you just said, you know, your students are asking why is this like this? And I was wondering if you could tell us, and we have just a few more minutes left, if sort of what you've been surprised by what they're asking in the context of everything that we've been talking about. Maybe what's still surprising you now, if anything?
That's a hard one. Every class is different, but I did start noticing this, because I've taught sort of kind of the same stuff for, more than a dozen years, but it has changed, the student audience has changed radically in a lot of ways. And there's just a lot of things they're much more willing to talk about, much more willing to ask. These questions about sort of equity and justice, I mean, they're just, it's right in the front of their mind. And honestly, people, social scientists like myself, who work on sort of social justice related issues, we have to be really careful at how we talked about this, and sort of not threaten anybody, make sure that people are comfortable and not push the boundaries. But now they're the ones, I feel like they're the ones dragging me a lot now, right? It's like, oh, you already, like, some of the stuff that we feel like academia did, it's like they already know, like, you guys haven't figured it out, so what's next? And where do we go from here? So it's a challenge, honestly. And some of it's age too. I mean, that's part of why we need younger scholars doing stuff, right? A fresh idea.
Does anyone have one last burning question? No, great. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you again to our panelists for their